Okay, welcome everybody to today's lecture as part of our journey through the contemporary philosophy of the African continent. Please note that the lecture will be recorded, but the discussion will not be recorded. The countries represented today are Botswana and Ghana, and most of you, I guess, will be familiar with Ghanaian philosophers, with, for instance, the famous Anton Wilhelm Amo, who might be considered more or less a Ghanaian German philosopher, and then, of course, the famous Kwame Jeche and Kwasi Wiredu. I'm very excited to listen today to one of the most competent speakers you can find in the field of indigenous psychology, speaking to us from Botswana. So let me introduce our expert. Seth Oppong is an associate professor of the Department of Psychology at the University of Botswana in Gaborone in Botswana. And he is also a research associate of the Department of Psychology at the University of Witwatersrand. He's viewed by many as a thinker and theoretician in psychology in Africa. His research includes cultural, historical, philosophical, and theoretical domains of psychology, as well as applied psychology, public psychology, and African psychology. We're honored that to have you here with us today, Seth, to speak about indigenous psychology in Africa. What can African philosophy offer African psychology? Dear Seth, you're very welcome. I'm looking forward to your speech, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me take a moment to share my screen. Because my screen is visible now. Thank you so much. And good evening here in Gaborone. It's 5 p.m. here. Yeah, and then good afternoon wherever you may be to the audience. My name is Seth Oppong, and I am going to present on indigenous psychology in Africa. What can African philosophy offer African psychology? The only thing that you need to know, in addition to what has been said before, is that I am the secretary of the Pan-African Psychology Union, which is a continental union of psychology national associations. So my presentation will basically move from understanding the motivations for indigenous psychology in Africa and trying to define what indigenous psychology is or has been conceptualized, and then we'll delve a bit into the scope of indigenous psychology in Africa. Then we'll look at culture as a central theme in indigenous psychology. Then we will look at how important Western philosophy has been to mainstream psychology or psychology as we understand it. And then the philosophical or African philosophical studies of the African and then African culture or African personhood. And then we will then look at how or why African philosophy needs to contribute to African psychology, or why African psychology has to borrow from African philosophy. I deliberately made it a question for us to interrogate what it will mean. And then we will discuss the way forward. So why indigenous psychology in Africa? One of the things that we need to understand is that mainstream psychology or psychology as has been conceptualized and understood by many, even on the continent of Africa, has been built solely on Western culture and philosophy. It just as one famous American psychologist said, every psychology is indigenous psychology. It's indigenous to where it develops. So much of the mainstream psychology has just simply been built on Western culture, being underpinned by individualism and other Western values. And there's nothing wrong with building a discipline built on Western values per se. We should also understand that mainstream psychology cannot entirely explain African behaviors. There are so many instances where a particular explanatory system offered within the Western or mainstream psychology fails to entirely account for the variations of behaviors from the continent of Africa and other, or from the majority of the world as we currently describe non-Western world today. And then we should also understand that though it might not be always deliberate, but Western psychology is colonial in its orientation. It marginalizes and dehumanizes the other. And let me be forthright here that I am not saying that somebody starts off by thinking of dehumanizing or marginalizing another group of people. But of course, there are people who deliberately do that, like the eugenics, who thought that, well, some people are of better breed, so the crossbreeding should only happen within that group. And many of the famous psychologists that you may know are actually part of that eugenic movement, including somebody like Spearman, who is known for his work on the G-factor theory of intelligence. And again, we should understand that there are cultural variations around the world. And that's how human nature has it. So we can't do anything about it. And my own particular position on this is that the current knowledge offered within mainstream psychology is valid. And is valid to the extent that it helps one group of people to understand themselves and to explain their behavior. However, that this current knowledge is limited in its capacity to account for the experiences of all humans around the world. It is in this spirit I always argue for indigenous psychology or decolonizing psychology, so that we can expand the narrow perspectives on human nature to make psychology a truly global human science, or a truly global science of all Homo sapiens, not just some subset of some Homo sapiens. Now, what does it mean to indigenize? And what does it mean to decolonize? Many people sometimes try to define indigenization and decolonization, but they conflate the two sometimes. To decolonize means to pull down the colonial institutional structures or institutions that make us think that knowledge is knowledge only when it comes from a certain geographical region, or when it is disseminated in a particular language. And for instance, if knowledge is contained in the Akan language of Ghana, it might not be seen as valuable knowledge as compared to when the knowledge is disseminated through the English language or any other European language that has become that very important for conceptualization, like the French, the Spanish, Italiano, and the rest, or German and the rest. But to say you are indigenizing, then you are saying that you want to embrace the ways of knowing and being that are inherent in a particular local culture as valid ways of knowing and being. In other words, you will allow yourself to understand that the way a certain group of people, other than Western people or Westerners, see the world and then try to understand what it means to gather knowledge, you will respect that and understand that it is as valid as any other forms of knowing and being. That is the beginning of indigenizing. Because if you don't begin from that perspective, you are going to get it wrong. Now, but then what is indigenous psychology? I have a lot of definitions here, but I'm not going to worry so much about those definitions. And I'll focus on my definition because it's my presentation. Yes. So in 2016, I tried to define what Pan-African psychology is. And I define it as a branch of psychology where the population of interest is the persons of African origin, and or where the target population resides either on the African continent or in the diaspora. This is very important to understand that if we say we are pursuing Pan-Africanism in psychology, then we would have to include all persons of African ancestry, including people, Africans of the soil, but not of the blood, like those in North Africa, because they are also African. They are Africans of the soil. And I've come to understand that some white South Africans have even doubted whether they are even Africans. And it is because a lot of people define African by either skin color or just by gene. But there are also Africans of the soil, but not of blood. And so if you are white South African, you are still African because you are African of the soil. And more recently, I have defined indigenous psychology as an orientation that adopts culture-conscious approach to the selection of research questions, design, data analysis, and interpretation of the results. So I mainstream culture, or I center culture in the idea of indigenous psychology. And what does it mean in this case, or in terms of the scope? A colleague, Ratelli, who is now at Stellenbosch University, identifies 4 strands of psychology, or what we can call African psychology. He identifies the Western-oriented African psychology, cultural African psychology, critical African psychology, and psychological African studies. And by Western-oriented African psychology, which is psychology in Africa, that's what dominates. And a lot of psychologists who are working in Africa or continental Africa, African psychologists are often in the Western-oriented African psychology because their work becomes very imitative of what is being done elsewhere and contributes nothing unique to expand our understanding of human nature from our center as Africans and our Africanness. After all, we need to understand that Western psychology is situated knowledge and praxis of psychology. It's situated because it's about one group of people and the practice occurs in that context. And so African psychology should, or indigenous psychology in Africa, should be understood in that context. That is African situated knowledge and praxis. And then cultural African psychology deals with culture and spirituality issues. Then we have the critical African psychology, where it's more about the material well-being and politics of decolonizing and how to use psychology to improve the well-being of the people, and how to promotize how psychology has structured knowledge production and knowledge use. And then we have the psychological African studies. And I would mention here some few psychologists who have been working in this space, including Vivienne Jokoto, I should say Ghanaian American or American Ghanaian, I don't know which one to use to describe her, but her work can be placed under psychological African studies. She attempts to study African issues from a psychological perspective. And I believe one of the most, I wouldn't say the most important work, but from my perspective, seemed to be a very seminal work that anybody in indigenous psychology in Africa should read, is the Adjumsem, the Akan theory of mind, which is a very powerful work that she has done. Yeah, so, and I would also place somebody like Stephen Bafweje and his work in sometimes I can say he's in cultural African psychology, sometimes critical African psychology, sometimes in psychological African studies. Yeah, and Richard Appiah, Kumar Gavi, and of course, you can also place my work in any of these strands. I'm not exhausting the list. I'm only mentioning a few of my colleagues here, so people can go and check out their work as well. And in terms of thinking about the scope of indigenous psychology in Africa by focal population, this is where I use Ali Mazruri's conceptualization of African by blood and African of the soil. Ali Mazruri is a late Kenyan political scientist, famous for his work on the paradoxical conditions or the paradoxical African conditions. He also developed some conceptualization that becomes very important here, that there are Africans by blood and of the soil. So you can simply say those of us south of Sahara in Africa will simply be Africans by blood and Africans of the soil. And then we have those who are Africans of the soil, but not by blood, like our friends in North Africa, and even some people in Southern Africa, including South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, and the rest. There are people who don't look like typical Africans, but they're Africans because they're Africans of the soil. And then we have those who are Africans by blood, but not of the soil, like the African Americans. And then we can also consider those who are not of the soil, not by blood, but simply because of the association with Africa, they become Africanist. And there are a couple of names I can mention here, but I will not personalize it. But why is culture a central theme in indigenous psychology? And why is it even possible to think of African culture as a monolithic entity? Is there anything called African culture anyway? Because in Ghana, for instance, you then have the Akans, you have the Evers, you have the Moli, the Gombes, and the rest. So you have a whole lot of different ethnic groups. But how come you say, oh, I argue that there's an African culture? Is there any African culture to begin with? I admit that there are observable variations in behaviors and practices across the continent of Africa. However, at a deeper level of the underlying assumptions, basic assumptions, that is where you tend to see commonalities. So, of course, and I've had the advantage of being in different African countries, so I'm a living proof of that. That you will be in Botswana, you will see people behave differently. But then when you have a conversation around the behavior, you understand that the meaning and the assumptions that underlie the behavior is no different from what you observe in Ghana or in Liberia or in Kenya or in any other part of Africa. So it's not because there are observable differences in behaviors and practices, but when it comes to the meaning of that behavior, the underlying assumptions, that is where you begin to see their commonality. And I like what one South African psychologist or critical psychologist argues, that although there may not be a unifying African metaphysics, there is nevertheless an approach to reality shared by a number of Africans. So yes, you may say, oh, well, of course, there's no agreement around that, but we can all understand that there's an approach to reality that is shared by all Africans, or a greater number of Africans. And in that sense, you can think of African culture as a monolithic entity. More or less, what a Western society can rally around and call it Western society. Because regardless of whether you are from France or from the US or from Germany or from the UK, there's still something that Western societies have in common. Of course, all human beings have things in common anyway, whether Western or non-Western. And then Shea and Long also had talked about 7 ways we have used culture in Africa, in our psychological studies in Africa, from being primordial to being paradoxical to being organic, and many other ways that we use culture. But what is important is that we should begin to understand that indigenous psychology cannot be without culture, because it is even from the strong foothold of culture that we begin to see that there is something unique that is specific to a particular context, because of which we have to then develop a certain approach to understanding the behavior in such a context, which may differ from other perspectives. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with Western situated knowledge of psychology. No, there's nothing wrong with it, because it is so valid that it helps one group of people to understand themselves. The only problem is that the same knowledge is not expansive enough to account for the variations in all human experiences, and therefore becomes a call on all other persons on earth to try, particularly those in psychology and anthropology and even in philosophy, to work out new ways of understanding people from their own context, to help expand that understanding, so that we not hear of situations where, say, American psychologists go somewhere after a disaster, and then their treatment and their practices fail woefully, and they admit that they fail woefully. It's because of the limited capacity of their kind of knowledge in understanding the people and providing treatment. So if there is an indigenous psychology from Africa, from other parts of the world, then it helps even Western scholars or psychologists to have unlimited access to knowledge from other areas that they can use to provide support and assistance where it becomes needed. That is, for me, that is the central theme, or why I even do indigenous psychology, so that we have access to all kinds of knowledge, so that you know that if I am dealing with Africans from the western part of Africa, this is the stock of knowledge that, as a psychologist coming from another part of the world, I have to dip into to be relevant and to have cultural competence in providing support. Or when it comes a time that African will be needed to provide some support to other people in the northern hemisphere, then they can also tap into the Western situated knowledge of human behavior and provide that same kind of support. Now, on the importance of Western philosophy in psychology, we can agree that, and a lot of discussion around the history of psychology will lead to this important point, that Western psychology partly evolved out of Western philosophy. As much as we can say there are physiological influences on the early emergence of psychology, but we can also agree that there are also Western philosophical influences as well. So, for instance, if you take the approach, the inductive method or approach that was developed by Francis Bacon, became the central theme or tool that influenced Skinner and his behavior analysis. Of course, René Descartes' work on the explanation of human behavior and other bodily functions also became the ground for stimulus response and radical behaviorism. So you see a direct link between either even if you are thinking of the humanistic philosophies of the 17th century in Europe, in particular, in Europe in particular, that still influence psychology or Western or mainstream psychology. Again, Descartes' work on animals or study of bodies of animals probably led to the study of, or even the emergence of comparative psychology as well. if you take the British empiricism and French sensationalism, they also influenced the emergence of psychology, from John Locke and associationism leading to behaviorism and classical conditioning and operant conditioning, as we know from psychology, from George Berkeley's theory of distance perception, Hume's laws of association of ideas, and more importantly, his argument around analysis of causation, which is very similar to how we understand causation today in psychology, or experiment in psychology, or experimentation in psychology. So you can see how Western philosophy has influenced the psychology that we know today, or mainstream or Western psychology, from Spinoza and psychoanalytic thinking, from Wolfgang von Goethe and phenomenology, and Wilhelm Nietzsche and Freud's idea of the id. They all evolved from the philosophies that Western philosophers developed around the 17th and the 18th century. And if you want to go as far as to the days of Aristotle and Plato, then you can see a lot of the work done by Aristotle on memory had found its way into modern understanding of memory in psychology. So there's no doubt about Western psychology influencing mainstream psychology, or Western philosophy influencing mainstream psychology or Western psychology. And then we even have some philosophers arguing against psychology as a discipline, as a scientific discipline, which we can say that Johann Friedrich Herbert, which according to German historiography is actually the founder of psychology, not Wilhelm Wundt, Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt, whom is accredited by the Anglo-American historiography as the founder of psychology, and even the German opposed 1879 as the year psychology sort of began at the University of Leipzig, at the lab of Wundt. It is rather credited to Johann Friedrich Herbert for his work in applying mathematics to the study of mental activities, which we can say started around 1824. So to the German, psychology probably emerged around 1824, and to the Americans and the rest of the world, 1879. And Wundt is the father of psychology to the Americans and the rest of the world. But Germans say it's Herbert, and I'll go with the Germans' version of history, because psychology evolved or emerged from Germany, or scientific psychology began from Germany. So I want to associate myself with the German version of history, not the British-led version of history. So these days I teach my students differently, and I know they may fail some tests because of the view I'm pushing on them. Yes, so we have Galileo, Augustine Comte, Immanuel Kant, and the rest, all saying psychology cannot be a science. In fact, Augustine Comte of sociology fame and positivism even argue that psychology is a metaphysical nonsense. It's something that we shouldn't even care about because it's all gibberish. But at the end of the day, the study of physiology and other natural sciences gave birth to psychology, made psychology possible to even evolve and emerge. And here, I have highlighted Anton Behemamo for, even though he may not have directly said anything about psychology, but I am being presentist here, and deliberately, because his work has been classified as psychologia by his former university. His work, his doctoral dissertation, when you go to his former university, you'll find his work classified as psychologia. Yeah, so I would classify him as one of those who may have argued for psychology becoming a scientific discipline. And I always have to prove his existence. I know it's so hard to always prove his existence. So I need to show my audience that he existed as a person. Is not a figment of our imagination. It's not something that is being cooked by some African psychologists or philosophers and other Western philosophers like who's Justin Smith, who I can say is one of the leading scholars on Amo, and his protege. I don't know whether to call him his protege, but a colleague in the US, Dwight. I think is Dwight or something. I can't always pronounce his name well, but I can share his name later on. Yeah. So, and apart from that, to prove his existence, in 2020, the Berlin authorities had to rename the Mall Street Anton Wilhelm Mall Street. So just to show that he existed and not something being cooked by a group of us. Yes. And on the issue of African philosophical studies of the African person and African culture, we can start by referring to Anton Wilhelm Mall's 1734 dissertation on the apathy of the mind. And then his 1783 Tractus. I think the arts of philosophizing soberly and accurately. Yeah, so, and in fact, I would suggest to all those who may be interested in his work to refer to this lady, Mens. Mens is, I think she's Dutch, yeah, and Polly has been in touch with her. She has done marvelous work by trying to break down Amo's philosophy of mind in simple terms that we can even work out into modern psychology or African psychology as we know it today. And from Jobo's work on African symbols, these are African philosophies. And unfortunately, all of them, I think most of them are dead or late, I should say. Yeah, from Jobo, African symbols and proverbs are source of knowledge, to his work on the image of man in Africa, to his work on knowledge and truth, to yes. So yeah, to Menkiti's person and community in African traditional thought, to Jete's African ethics, his work again on tradition and modernity, and then his work on African cultural values, which is very important, and his inaugural lecture that he turned into a book, The Unexamined Life, Philosophy and the African Experience, which is a very useful book. And then an essay on African philosophical thought, the Akan Conceptual Scheme, Ikionobe, his work on the African philosophical perspectives on communalism and morality in African traditions, to Mbiti's work on religions, African religions and philosophies, Men's work on, though she is not African per se, but her work is so important for us as African psychologists. Her work on Anton Wilhelm Mall's philosophy of the mind, Redu's concept, African concept of personhood. These are all important work that every psychologist in Africa should be reading. It should be on, you should have a copy of some of these books or have either hard copies or soft copies, or they should be on your reading list. It's so important because they help you to conceptualize personhood differently from an African perspective, and then it engages your mind to think of how differently you can approach the study of human nature from the African philosophical grounding. And it's very important that we take this. Now, should African philosophy be contributing to African psychology? Or African psychology should be borrowing from African philosophy? I think it should be the way around. African psychologists should be borrowing from African philosophy. To a great extent, African philosophers have done the work that they need to do. They have set the foundation. But it's something that African psychologists themselves have to take what African philosophers have done and let it do what Western philosophy did for Western psychology. Because if you look at it, Western psychologists had to take Western philosophies and turn them into what mainstream psychology is today. So I would not begrudge African philosophers for not necessarily moving into African psychology or indigenous psychology in Africa, because that's probably not their role. And giving someone whose argument or my literary tool in my work has always been reductio ad absurdum or argumentum ad absurdum, it becomes very absurd to expect those who work in African philosophy to also be the same people who will translate their philosophy into African psychology or indigenous psychology in Africa. Then what is the role of African psychologists or indigenous psychologists in Africa? Then we should just forget about indigenous African psychologists and focus on African philosophy, because they have done their work. Jete did his part. Kwesi Redu, until his death, I think, is it early this year or late last year? I think, yeah. And until his death, did his part. Menkiti and the rest have also done their part. It's up to African psychologists or indigenous psychologists in Africa to take what they have done and translate that into new ways of thinking, new ways of knowing, and new ways of being. For instance, if you take Jobo's work on Proverbs as sources of knowledge, that's all he can do as a philosopher. It's up to African psychologists or indigenous psychologists in Africa to just take what African philosophers have argued about and translate them into work in psychology. If he has argued, Jobo has argued that Proverbs are a source of knowledge, then it's important for African psychologists to begin to interrogate the Proverbs. And let me say a big thank you to Jokoto again, Vivian Jokoto, for her work on trying to analyze some of the Akan proverbs to understand how we express emotions as Akan or as Africans. From the psychological African studies perspective, which is a strand in African psychology. So these are some of the work, even her work on Adjumsem, the Akan theory of mind, is still based on the African philosophies. My own work on the model of valued human cognitive abilities was also based on Jechi's work and other African philosophers. And of course, my work on ethics, I base it on Redu's principle of sympathetic impartiality to advance a new way of thinking about ethics that has nothing to do with Western orientation to ethics and application of ethics. So we have that responsibility as indigenous psychologists in Africa or African psychologists to take what African philosophers have done already. Redu could not have done what I did. All he could do is what he did by advancing the argument for the principle of sympathetic impartiality. I had to read it and to see how that can be applied in ethical decision-making in the practice of psychology. So we have that responsibility as African psychologists to take what has been done by African philosophers and translate them and build on them, because that is what Western psychologists in the early beginnings of psychology took Western philosophies and built on them so that we have what we know now to be Western or mainstream psychology. So we do have that responsibility as such. So if you are not reading any of those things, then it's very disturbing as an African psychologist. Apart from Bafwe J, and also his work on personhood from psychology based on some of the philosophical work that I've mentioned. You have Richard Appiah also working in the area of ethics, also using African philosophical ideas on personhood to advance how ethics or informed consent should be obtained in a rural African context. These are the sort of work I expect to see going forward. And again, my very good friend Kuma Gavi and his work on the conception of personhood from a Ghanaian ethnic perspective, which is also psychological work, but taking the philosophy that has gone before him and building on that. It's almost like X-File, experimental philosophy, where you take what psychologists are doing and then you apply some psychological tools and methods to test some philosophical ideas. Yeah, so it's almost just like that, but it shows that there's hope for the future when African psychologists or indigenous psychologists begin to focus on the use of African philosophy to build on them as their base to develop new ways of thinking, new ways of being, new ways of doing things in psychology that can expand the narrow perspective that currently exists in psychology, so that we can have a psychology which is a truly global science of human nature, or at least of all human beings, not some subset of human beings as it exists today. So that is something that we need to really understand. So going forward, what should we be thinking about? I know it's sad, but I believe that African psychology and African philosophy should be something that it should be found or should be placed in psychology curricula in Africa. You cannot do psychology. If you do history and philosophy of psychology, it's heavily Western philosophy. Yes, it's heavily Western philosophy. So then the question is, how come? We also have African philosophy, but those African philosophies or African philosophical arguments don't feature in our curriculum. So we should introduce that. And I remember when I was in Liberia at Tubman University, and we're revising the curriculum, I made sure that we introduced into it African psychology and African philosophy as much as possible. And even here at UB, that's the University of Botswana, revising the curriculum, I have also made sure that we do have that content. So our students will be exposed not just to Western philosophies in psychology, but they also be exposed to African philosophy, so that they can expand their understanding of what it means to be a psychologist in Africa. Well, I also think that African psychologists, here I'm not going to blame any African philosopher. We have to reach out to our colleagues in African philosophy to collaborate with them. And interestingly, I have seen quite an interesting collaboration between one Ghanaian philosopher at the University of Ghana and a group of, I think, health professionals, some from medicine, public health, and the rest. And they had, I think they have, I know so. They have a paper in the Lancet. I know you'll be thinking, philosophy and Lancet. It becomes like, it can't sit well. But yes, he collaborated with some people from public health and medicine about applied ethics in medical practice. So it's up to us also as African psychologists or indigenous psychologists in Africa to reach out to across the divide to our friends in African philosophy, to collaborate with them, to work with them. Because when we collaborate, there's something unique that can come out of that. They may not be thinking of that now, but we should make the first move and reach out to them to do that. And I always think that polymathy is very important as a way to integrate African psychology and African philosophy. We do need people who have multiple interests, wide interests, that cover areas including psychology and philosophy or African philosophy to integrate, because as of now, the collaboration is going to suffer a bit. And I don't want to say that, I mean, after 15 years, 20 years, I don't want to be one of the few persons who will still be working in this area. There should be other people interested in that to integrate African philosophy and African psychology. That becomes very important. And we should encourage our students to have philosophical focus in psychology. You know, around 2012, yes, I think so, 2012, I came across a dissertation by a master's student, or a thesis by a master's student in Australia. And I think his thesis, there's no way it will pass in many African psychology departments, because it was purely philosophical and methodological. No data were gathered. See, basically theoretical, if I should say so. He was arguing about, and in fact, his work is very important, very central to a new or emerging tools for or ways of studying human behavior in psychology, the observational behavior modeling, which does not use any of the tools statistical tools that we are familiar with. So I guess in the next 20, 50 years, psychology will not remain the same. And those who fail to keep up will lose their expertise in psychology, because what will become mainstream will no longer be those statistics, but it will be more of the observational behavior modeling. That is quite different. And that work was simply about that. The early years, it was historical because it was tracing the history of measurement in psychology. It was methodological. It was also arguing and positioning a new method in psychology. It was philosophical because it was arguing about the philosophy of science behind all of those things. But I know there's no way, even today, maybe at very few psychology departments. Because now I'm associated with WITS, let me make a guess that maybe WITS will pass such a thesis. Maybe University of Cape Town might pass such a thesis, but the rest of the psychology departments on the continent of Africa will not even look at the work to begin with, let alone send it for external examination. There's no way. It's because, but when we fail to interrogate the philosophy behind the psychology we are learning and teaching and practicing, we fail to understand what is fundamentally wrong with it, and we fail to understand why what we are doing is failing or is not working. So it's very important that we encourage our students and allow our students who want to specialize in that. I do know that if you take philosophical psychology or philosophy of psychology, as of now, you don't, even in the Western society or the Western countries, there are not too many psychology departments that train people in that. I can only talk about, I think, University of Groningen. They have a certain department that is very heavy on theoretical psychology and philosophical psychology. York University that is associated with my colleague Thomas Teo and Warden Pickering and others. Yeah, and many others in that department, and then also Simon Fraser University in Canada. They also have a very functional department that has a unit on theoretical philosophical psychology. Other than that, we don't have so many people specializing in that. So you can imagine on the continent of Africa, it will be like if you do this, if you pursue this, you become like an outcast, as you say. All right, so this is very important that we need to begin to encourage our students who are interested in that to focus on this. And I let me say here that I became very excited when a certain student who is, I think she used to be at UCT or so, and then now she has moved to Stellenbosch or Wits. She was telling me after reading my work on psychological theoretics, which is a new subfield, well, let me call it a new subfield I've been working to advance in psychology. Yes, I want my own subfield in psychology. I'm tired of pursuing other people's subfields. So I've tried to argue for psychological theoretics as a new subfield. And she read it and she said she was so happy about it. That's what she wants to pursue. But the current environment, whether at UCT or at Stellenbosch or so, doesn't allow that. And this means that something has to change. So our students who are interested in the philosophical issues can concentrate on them, because without them, this discipline of psychology in Africa is going to become blunt. Yes, the discipline will be tasteless, because there won't be anything exciting, anything daring, anything stimulating about that. Yes, and here I let me end here again on this note. My previous presentation, I ended on this note as well, but let me also do this again. Let me refer to a paper in Conversation that says Nobel Prizes most often go to researchers who defy specialization. In fact, I'm not saying you should be an anthropologist and become an economist. I'm not saying that, but if you can, yes, there's something you can do anyway. But what is important is what Christiane said. She said in 2017 that you should, as far as possible, avoid mainstream areas in order to develop, or in order to be able to develop an independent profile on work and work on an original self-selected topic. It is so important. If we want to allow African philosophy to inform African psychology, then you should avoid mainstream ideas, because mainstream ideas will make your work imitative and it will not draw the necessary attention to you. And I say this, and I made a presentation, I think 3 days ago or so, and I made similar argument about this, and people fail to understand me that if you fail to do exciting, daring, stimulating work, nobody is going to pay attention to you. You can cry all you want, you can complain all you want, but nobody, because we have limited time on earth to waste on things that are not exciting to you. So why bother? So it's very important to do that. It's so important. On this note, I would say thank you for the attention and listening to whatever I have to say. Thank you so much. I've tried to share some important texts that you can use. From Jobo to Jeche, to Ikonobi, to Menkiti, and Biti, and Kusireju, and the rest. These are very important texts that all African psychologists should have on their reading, and should read them, actually read them and use them in their work. Because there are a lot of things. Take Jeche's work, African cultural values. I have a PhD student here who is working on work ethic in the public service or public administration. but she's also fascinated with African psychology and African philosophy. So I lent her the book, and she found very useful work on work ethic that Jeche had worked on in his African cultural values and introduction. So there are so many things. People think it's just about mental health. There's something for industrial psychology, something for community psychology, something for health psychology. All the subfields, you are likely to find something in African philosophy if you look hard enough, because the original proponent do not always know what we want as psychologists. So it's up to us as psychologists to look hard enough to find them and to bring them up, just like I did with Ray Du's principle of sympathetic impartiality. I looked hard enough and brought it to psychology. Yeah, so these are some important texts. So I will say thank you, and I'll end here and interact with you. Thank you so much.